Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the Canon RF 24 to 240 millimeter. This is an F4 to 6.3 IS and has a USM focus motor. And so probably like many of you, starting to get a little bit stir crazy if your country that you're in is practicing some sort of isolation response to COVID-19. And so for many of us, even though today it's a little bit cool outside, and as you can see behind me, a lot of our snow has still not melted, but there is a little taste of spring in the air. So I thought it'd be a great day to come into the backyard and to shoot this review outside, getting some sunshine rather than indoors. So most of the RF lenses to this point have been these extreme, both in price and performance lenses. And I've been really thankful to see some of Canon's creativity. They have been creating some of the very best lenses that have been released in each of their respective fields in the last year or so for the new Canon RF mount. At the same time, however, one of the things that you have probably heard me be critical about is the fact that to this point, there have been, out of 10 lenses that have been released for the RF mount, there have been a grand total of 2 of them that fall under the $1,000 threshold in terms of price. And so I've already reviewed one of those, which was the RF 35 millimeter f1.8. Today I'm reviewing the second. This really is less of a kit lens and more of a kind of all-in-one with a 10 times zoom range, which allows you to go from this on the wide end to this on the telephoto end. So obviously that's extremely useful to have that all in one lens. It also helps to fill the gap for those that are looking for a travel-oriented lens on the RF mount. And so it allows you to cover everything from wide angle to telephoto and pretty much everything in between. So today we're here to break down in detail what the actual performance of this lens is. And so first of all, I do want to say a big thank you to Canon Canada for getting me a loaner ahead of my recent trip. A lot of these shots that I'll be sharing I took while in the mountains in Virginia. I had a great time. And so anyway, and it was a great companion for that trip. So we're going to dive in today, dive in deep to the details of performance. There's some interesting things to detail as a part of the optical performance as well as the build and function. And so I do want to spend time highlighting that. However, if you're not one that's interested in all the nitty gritty and you want things delivered in a more concise, quick fashion, I encourage you to tune in at the end of the week for my standard review, which will cover everything in about 10 minutes or so and give you the information that you need for there. But if you want the nitty gritty, you're in the right place. Let's jump in and let's start by taking a look at the build and handling of the lens. So let's take a closer peek here. And so this is kind of the standard look that we have now come to expect from the RF mount lenses. It has this kind of platinum colored transition area here and a little bit of extra shape, maybe a little bit of extra style compared to similar EF mount lenses. However, you can tell from the build grade that it is, it's not quite at an L series in terms of the materials here. However, it feels like it's going to be sturdy and durable like a lot of the standard EF lenses that, kind of fall into this kind of consumer grade category would be. So a few things to highlight here. Obviously, we have the new and improved mount here, RF mount with more communication. There is no weather sealing gasket here. One unfortunate thing I would say for a travel type lens, but Canon is consistent in that they don't include weather sealing in their non-premium lenses. In this case, you have 2 switches here, and so kind of a unique approach that is the first that I've seen to, on Canon at least, to a couple of these things. First of all, while you do have the control ring here, it's actually not a third ring, it's a dual purpose ring. And so you have to choose between using it as a focus ring or as a control ring. So probably most of the time you'll want to keep it in the control ring setting, unless you actually need to manually focus. There is also just an on and off switch for the stabilizer. The stabilizer is rated by CIPA up to 5 stops of assistance, and I found it to be quite effective in a number of my handheld shots. What is missing here, and I found that I actually missed, was an actual AF/MF switch here. I mean, even though I am manually focusing here, nothing is happening. And unfortunately, in this case, this is why I really miss it probably more than what I do on Sony, for the simple reason that if you go into the quick menu, it's not amongst the options there, and so you're going to have to actually go into the full menu, go under the AF setting, or you can map it to a custom mode, and then actually select manual focus. And then and only then will, depending on what kind of focus aid you're using. So here the focus guide is available now, but it's not going to be there unless you actually choose that. And so a little bit clunkier maybe, and so I do kind of miss having an AF/MF switch on the lens itself. The next thing you're going to see is a very wide zoom ring, and so the lens does extend significantly, as you can see with a double barrel. There's a little tiny bit of play inside there. If you kind of manually move it, there's a little bit of wobble. Not too bad, but not as tight as the best lenses that extend like that I've seen. There's also a lock here, and I did find, at least when out hiking, I hiked a fair bit using the lens, that the lock was useful. After a little bit of walking along, I would find, just maybe a little bit of rubbing on your body. Eventually the lens would be extended out, and so I started to utilize the lock as a part of that. Up front, we have a 72mm front filter thread, and unfortunately, the lens does not ship with a hood, kind of behaving like non-L series lenses. Canon persist in not including a hood. That came back to bite me. I did fall on one of my hikes, and I got a little bit of scraping on the front coating where it hit some dirt or little pebbles, rocks, and so anyway, I wish that a lens hood had been there to help to protect that front element. It does come with standard caps, and kind of everything else is standard as you might expect. Now, in terms of our specifications, it is a 1.65 pounds in terms of weight, or 751 grams. It's not as light as what kit lenses might be in a lot of cases. However, it's not overly burdensome either. And in terms of our length and diameter, 3.2 inches in diameter, or a little over 81 millimeters, and 4.8 inches in length, about 122 millimeters. Another thing that's worth noting, as has been the case with a number of recent zoom lenses that I've seen, is that there's actually two minimum focus distances. And so on the wide end, you can actually focus down closer, down to a 0.5 meter, 1.64 feet. At the telephoto end, that extends out to 0.78 or 2.56 feet. And so you need about an extra foot if you're at the telephoto end. Your maximum magnification is going to come at the 240mm setting, and it is a useful 0.26 times magnification. Our optical formula here is fairly complex, 21 elements in 15 groups, which contains both one aspherical element along with two UD elements. Inside there are 7 aperture blades that are rounded. So outside of a few handling quirks there that I don't necessarily love, I found the lens to be easy to use out in the field. And so as you can see, for the most part, things are good here. The only thing I really want to criticize is that I really wish Canon would leave behind their ideology of only including things like a weather sealing gasket or further weather sealing, and even more importantly, not including a lens hood with anything outside of their premium lenses. That's just not something that's matched with any other lens maker. And, I reviewed a $69 lens a month or so ago that came with a lens hood. And so, and all the time I'm reviewing lenses that cost, just a few $100s that come with a lens hood included. So to me, that really seems like an archaic throwback. And, to be charging another $40 in the US, another $60 here in Canada for a lens hood, Canon, you can do better than that. Now, a little bit more on autofocus. We did talk a little bit about the manual focus functionality and that dual purpose of the focus ring slash control ring there. But when it comes to the autofocus, first of all, understand that we are still working within the constraints of the focus system of the mirrorless bodies that are available. namely the EOS R and the EOS RP. I'm hoping that when the EOS R5 and R6 comes, that we're going to get a much more robust performance when it comes to burst speed and tracking. Right now, it was kind of a sad comparison when I was out there the day I'd taken this combination. This is the EOS R and then the 24-240. I also happened to be testing at the same time the Sony 100 to 400 millimeter G Master lens, and I had that mounted on the A9. And yes, I know that's not a fair comparison at all, but wow, what a shock it was to go from the 20 frames per second and amazing tracking abilities of that combination, and then to come over to this lens and to feel like I could count the seconds in between each shot that was being taken. Not quite that bad, but of course there are some serious limitations. So I say that to say it's hard to make a final assessment as to how good, say, the tracking abilities of this lens would be when we're still limited by the constraints of the autofocus systems and the cameras that it's attached to. So this lens actually employs a combination of nano USM along with some stepping motor technology, and Canon specifically lists having both of those things. So nano USM it's a great focus system in this type of lens. In this type of lens, the elements are not particularly large and heavy. So what that means is you don't need as much torque to drive them. And so nano USM in lenses like this gives you very, very fast autofocus, gives you very quiet autofocus, and autofocus without any kind of drama. It just gets the job done. In fact, it's so quiet that, just holding and shooting, it's bright enough out here that I couldn't tell if it was actually focusing. So I actually had to put my eye up to the viewfinder to make sure that focus is actually taking place. That's how quick and how quiet it is. So you can go from a close object to infinity basically without seeing focus at all take place. It's just basically instantaneous. And so I suspect that, when it comes to tracking action, that it probably won't be terrible because of that. And in fact, even with the limitations of the EOS R, as long as I kept it down at the 5 frames per second where it's actually continuing to focus, drive focus, I actually got consistently focused results. I did try the faster setting, and it's okay if your panning action and the distance stays about the same, but if there was, movement in and out in terms of distance, I definitely noticed that focus was starting to fall off. And so, 5 frames per second is pretty slow. And so anyway, but I don't think that that's a limitation of the focus system. IAF works fine. It gets the job done. I'll comment a little bit more during our image quality section about the image stabilization, but it also works very well. It's rated at 5 stops according to SEPA, and I was able to get very good hand-holding results. And again, there's no drama there. You're not going to see when it kicks on or when it turns off. And so it's nice and quiet in operation. With my ear right up against the lens barrel, I can hear a little bit of clicking type noise that is related to the actual IS system. But even with just my eye against the viewfinder, I can't hear it in operation. And so it's very quiet and effective. So kudos to them on that. So let's talk about image quality. Image quality is a complicated subject whenever you're talking about a super zoom type lens. Engineers, unlike with a prime lens, they can optimize for that one focal length. When you're talking about a lens like this, you have to try to account for both the engineering challenges of wide angle and telephoto. So that invariably means that there are going to be some compromises involved. And that's certainly the case here. Let's take a closer look and find out what those compromises are. So first of all, when we take a look at our distortion and vignette at 24 millimeters, we see some really interesting things. And so this kind of popped up only when I began to review my images in post, because I didn't see this effect on the back of the camera as I was being shown a corrected JPEG. So what you see here is that at 24 millimeters, there's actually a mechanical vignette. And what I mean by that is that this is more than just shading in the corner. There is actually obstruction into where the lens doesn't actually cover the full frame image circle. So what you've got here is probably wider than 24 millimeters, and it's depending on correction to get you back to 24 millimeters. So the reason I can say that with confidence is that if you begin to stop the lens down, so here's F4, F5.6. You see the shading is starting to brighten up, F6.3 and F8. And so what we see is vignette lift, but even at F8, you see that the mechanical vignette remains. These corners are still shaded completely. And so this is a lens that is designed for correction to get you the end result. So if I enable the profile in post, here's what I get. So comparing those two, you can see that there has been a significant amount of cropping in. Here's the first image that alerted me to this. As I looked at it in post, I thought, oh, I must have had the lens hood on crooked, because that's typically what I've seen. And then I realized I didn't have a lens hood for the lens. And so it had to be something else. And so it is this, and as soon as I applied the profile and it disappeared, I thought, oh, it was designed for this, and you can clearly see that that is the case. So the good news is that you do end up with a, a good end result after correction. I mean, once that's gone, everything looks fine here as expected, but it is kind of it's maybe one of the most extreme cases that I've ever seen of a lens that is kind of purposely designed with a mechanical vignette, there before correction. Now, as you start to go on through the focal range, here at 52 millimeters, we've got a mild amount of pincushion distortion, very, very little vignette actually, and so you see it corrects much more cleanly, and of course doesn't need that, tremendous crop to produce the end result. At 100 millimeters, you've got a pretty obvious amount of pincushion distortion and a little bit more vignette there in the corners. Once again, it cleans up pretty cleanly without a whole lot of loss of image. At 240 millimeters, like 100 millimeters, there's a pretty obvious amount of pincushion distortion that is evident there that, as we'll see in a moment, you will see in images. The vignette is at its highest level outside of 24 millimeters. Fortunately, once again here, all of this can correct pretty cleanly and simply, and so no real issue. Here's a real world shot where I saw that pincushion distortion. This is at 203 millimeters, and you can see that there's quite a bit of curve there. And you can see after the profile is applied, the line is nice and straight. So just note, I mean, you will need to rely on using the profile in a lot of situations, because unlike some kind of optical defects, these are kind of outside the scope of just, acceptable or stylistic. They require correction to get the right kind of result. You do definitely see some lateral CA that, exhibits in this fringing along the edges. It's not so much about defocus, it's just not an ability to accurately focus all the colors simultaneously. And so you do see some of that lateral, but not so much longitudinal chromatic aberration. So after you apply the profile, this is the end result. So this is what I was actually thought I was framing looking at the viewfinder, and here is what the raw image actually looks like. So what you've got is a significantly wider than 24 millimeter look that relies on correction to get it back to a 24 millimeter-ish framing. So we'll look at, for the sake of our sanity, we'll look at the corrected images here. One other thing that I want to highlight here is that you can see looking at this, I'd actually, as I typically do, I'd actually set the temperature. I set temperature according to my light, so 5,000 Kelvin, I should say. And when setting that in camera, I found that it delivered a warm image, which I found to be the case in real world shooting, that it just rendered a little bit warm as well. So here is, kind of basing off of the, the medium gray here as to set a white balance. And so you end up with a considerably, cooler end result based on that. So this is what I saw coming out of camera that immediately struck me as being on the warm side. And so after I did a custom profile using my data color checker and creating a profile, what I found is that as compared to other lenses, there was more in the green channel that needed to be pulled down, along with a little bit more in the yellows, but it's mostly in the greens that pull down. And so end result is that you end up with better skin tones with a with a custom profile, obviously. But if we look here on the left, you can see that it's definitely on the warm green kind of tinge naturally. And in some situations, that slightly warm rendering is actually useful. I feel like it produces results that are nice and clean, and I discovered only in post that there actually was a deer in this shot as well. But you can see, looking at the overall image here, this actually looks pretty decent. There is quite a good amount of detail throughout the frame. It's certainly a useful image. So taking a quick look at sharpness here at 24 millimeters, what we see is this is actually at a 2:1 magnification, so 200%, so you can see it clearly. Actually, that's not a bad result. We see that, it doesn't have a great acuity, ability to render really fine details, which, kind of sets the better lenses apart. And what I see is a fairly even profile here. Not too bad a result here in the mid frame and then going off into the corner. Again, while there's not amazing acuity and micro contrast, you can see it is, getting the fine details. What you can also see is that lateral CA when you get towards the edge is significant. There's lots of it there, and you can see it along here as well. Stopping down to f5.6 gives us a boost in contrast in the center of the frame. You can see, you can just start to read, well, if you read German, you can start to read the details there now better. Moving to the mid frame, we can see that, you got a little bit better contrast overall. Not a lot of extra resolution, but definitely better contrast. And moving down into the corner, there's a pretty noticeable difference in the contrast here that looks a lot better. Now, unfortunately, the nature of lateral chromatic aberration, it doesn't naturally correct as you stop the lens down. Fortunately, it is very easy to correct for in post. Stopping on down to f8 gives you a little bit more boost in terms of acuity and so just and better contrast here. And so, this is it's not an exceptional result, but it's pretty decent here at 24 millimeters. So moving on to 35 millimeters, I want you to note that maximum aperture is now f4.5 at 35 millimeters, just to give you an idea as we go along in the focal range. So we've got f4.5 and f5.6, so not quite a full stop difference. What you can see is that there's a little bit better contrast at 35 millimeters than what we saw at 24 millimeters, and so less of a noticeable. There is an improvement, but it's not as noticeable. Moving off towards the middle of the frame, we can see that, again, there's an uptick in the contrast, but it's mild, it's not significant here. And moving off into the corner, what we can see here is that in the corner you definitely have a more improved contrast. I'll also just point out, jumping over here, that while we continue to have that, lateral chromatic aberration, it actually shows up almost more at f5.6 because there's more of a vignette lift that takes place. But what you can see here is that the lateral chromatic aberration is still there, but it's not as pronounced at 35 millimeters. Stopping on down to f8 gives us a little bit more contrast, not a whole lot more in terms of resolution. We've kind of tapped out what you're going to get out of this. So at 50 millimeters, maximum aperture is now f5, and so we've lost another 1/3 stop of light. So looking at the center of the frame, kind of similar story, not amazing acuity here at 50 millimeters wide open. Stopping down to f5.6, which is now only 1/3 of a stop. Stopping down gives us a little bit of an improvement when it comes to contrast. What we can see here is not great acuity here, and but we can see that it's fairly consistent in its performance. Not a whole lot of drop from corner to corner. Very, very little difference in the mid frame stopping down. However, in the corner, you can definitely see a boost of contrast and, a little bit more detail rendered stop down to f5.6. Stopping on down to f8 actually gives us a more noticeable boost here because you are stopping the lens down more significantly since the maximum aperture was smaller. We'll go jump back to the center for a second here so you can see there. There is definitely a further boost in contrast, and so you definitely get a little bit more of the detail rendered. There are limits, as we saw before, to how much improvement you're going to get. The next mark point on the barrel is 70 millimeters. Now we're to f5.6, and so we've lost a full stop of light in terms of maximum aperture. What we see here is kind of a similar story. We've seen fairly consistently. I actually think it's a little bit stronger here at 70 millimeters than what I saw at 50 millimeters. Stopping on down to f8, which is now our next kind of full stop, you see a mild boost in contrast, not a huge difference, however, between the two. Looking at our $2 bill, we see the improvement is only mild here, and looking down into the corner is brighter. There's a little bit more contrast, but you can see, looking like here to here, the detail is still really not all that great. It's only a mild improvement that we see. So the next point marked is 100 millimeters. It actually showed up as 105 millimeters in my test here, just the way that it lined up. So looking at the center of the frame, by the way, maximum aperture is still f5.6, around 100 millimeters. Center of the frame, resolution is is okay, not great acuity. Stop down, it's still not amazing, but you can see there's an improvement in contrast. Looking at the mid frame, you can see, again, it's a boost in contrast, but still not amazing detail rendering. Lateral chromatic aberration is not an issue here to the same degree. As you can see, you definitely see a difference in the corners. And so, I mean, when you want sharpness across the frame, obviously that's where you get your biggest advantage, is when you stop down. Now by 150 millimeters, the next marked zone, our maximum aperture is at the smallest of the zoom range, and that is at f6.3. So what we see at 150 millimeters is kind of a similar pattern. Not great acuity. Stopping down to f8 gives us a little bit more contrast. You know, it looks acceptable. It's not exceptional in any way, but it looks okay there. At the mid frame, fairly, you know, looking more soft at 150 millimeters wide open. Down to f8 helps with the contrast, but you can see that the rendering of fine details, they're kind of muddy here. And so we're starting to get maybe out of the peak performance of the range. We see a little bit more lateral chromatic aberration than what we did previously. Corners, you know, increasing contrast, stopping down to f8, but you can see that the fine detail, you know, it pops a little bit more for better contrast, but there's not necessarily a lot of additional detail or resolution that's showing up. So at 240 millimeters, we see, I would say, actually a little bit better than what I saw at 150 millimeters. And stopping down, you see just a mildly better result. Where you're all starting to see is some lateral chromatic aberration that is starting to exert itself again. Looking here, there's a marked contrast in our amount of contrast when we stop things down. However, as we've been seeing in the pattern, we're not getting a lot of additional detail. You can definitely see the lateral chromatic aberration popping up again. And of course that is going to limit performance somewhat. And so my framing's a little bit tighter here because I ran out of room at 240 millimeters in my typical testing space to fit it in on the test chart. But you can see same kind of pattern, more contrast, not a whole lot of extra detail. So our maximum magnification is 0.26 times, and so you can see what that looks like. It's at 240 millimeters, and this is as tight as you can frame, and you know, that's definitely very useful. Detail, you know, as per usual, the contrast is not amazing. There's not a bad amount of detail there, so it's certainly useful for some applications. So of course, at this stage, you might be wondering, now why would I ever want a lens like this? Well, the main reason is for the flexibility of the focal range. And so on the left side, you see the framing at 24 millimeters. On the right side, you see the framing of the same scene standing in the same shot at 240 millimeters. This allows you to get shots that frankly you can't get under other circumstances, and certainly while traveling. It allows you to quickly react to situations and just get a huge variety of different shots, and thus get shots that you might not have otherwise gotten. Here's a case in point. I was out hiking and I had this lens, and all of a sudden I look up and there's this sweet little deer looking at me from a ways away. Well, if I had my typical lens, a 35 millimeter, a 50 millimeter, maybe an 85 millimeter, I wouldn't have gotten much of a shot in terms of the framing. But because of having a 240 millimeter focal length here, I was able to get this shot, and frankly, it's really not all that bad. I mean, the end result is nice, and ended up with some shots that I really liked, that I thought was very cute. And so there is the value of having a lens like this. Another area of the lens that I was impressed in is the performance of the stabilizer. And so in this shot, I had just inadvertently, because I was in AV mode, had been shooting outside, I didn't realize how low the shutter speed was dropping. So I looked at the image, it was at 1/6 of a second. So I was about to raise the ISO and reshoot it, but I zoomed in, looked at the detail, and realized that it was, perfectly sharp, that there was no sign of motion blur, even though I was shooting at 1/6 of a second. The bokeh performance is, reasonable. You don't look to a lens like this for the maximum performance, but I felt like many of my images had a nice overall look to them. And so, this, for example, shooting this image here, I thought that the bokeh, you can see some, some geometric deformation that's taking place, but the overall softness, you can compress backgrounds and get, pretty nice looking images with the lens. Of course, also shooting at the telephoto length to give you different opportunities for framing. And so this was a lens, or an image, that I thought was quite beautiful, shot with the lens. Shot some action, and of course the The only body I have really to test on right now that's out for using a lens like this is the EOS R, which does not have great burst rate or amazing tracking capabilities, but the actual end results I got from these shots I thought were really quite nice. And so again, the ability to zoom in and shoot shots like this is certainly useful. And then of course the dogs posing at the end, I thought that was a lovely way to end our image quality assessment. So of course the big standout there is that somewhat odd effect that I've never seen on a Canon lens before, and frankly I don't know that I've hardly seen it on any other lens before, where there's such an amazing reliance on correction and cropping the image via correction to eliminate a mechanical vignette. It's odd, but the end result is that as long as you're using that profile either in camera or correcting a raw file in post, it's not a major issue because they have been engineered for it, but certainly it's a bit of an oddity. And so at the end of the day, I'm really thankful for a lens like this. And even though it's far off from the image quality that's ideal to me as a photographer, I'm still strongly considering the idea of adding this lens to my kit, for the simple reason that there are times that I'm more concerned with being able to get the shot than I am with ultimate image quality. And I suspect that there are those of you that are in that same kind of boat. And this is a lens that at a reasonable price, $899, it gives you a lens that does a lot of things reasonably well. And it's not exceptional at anything outside of its flexibility, but it's far off from the poorest performance that I've seen from lenses like this. And so certainly worth a look. I had the same kind of feeling when I looked at the Tamron 28 to 300 millimeter that they developed for full-frame DSLRs. And I think that this lens does what that Tamron did, except for even a little bit better, in that it's giving you a wider focal length to begin with, and it gives you, I think, more consistent performance throughout the range. And so anyway, I think it's certainly worth a look if you're looking for an all-in-one lens or a good travel option for your new Canon mirrorless body. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you'll take a look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. There's also linkage to an image gallery if you want to look at these variety of photos, both taken here in Canada, but also in Virginia while traveling. And so you can check out those photos there. There's also buying links if you want to purchase one for yourself. Beyond that, of course, typical linkage to follow me on social media, become a patron, or subscribe to my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.